I watched from my window as Mr. Holden stepped out of his apartment across the hall, locking the door behind him. He was an older man, always polite but distant, the kind of neighbor who nodded in the hallway but never made small talk. His departure was nothing unusual except for what happened next. Just as his footsteps faded down the stairwell, I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. I turned back toward my peephole, expecting to see someone breaking in, but it wasn't a burglar. It was him. Mr. Holden stepped back into his apartment, closing the door behind him. My breath caught. I had just seen him leave. I wasn't mistaken. I watched him descend the stairs with my own eyes. And yet, here he was, as if he'd never left at all. I stood frozen by the door, pulse quickening. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I'd seen something that wasn't real. But before I could talk myself out of my unease, something else happened. The hallway lights flickered. A slow, rhythmic buzzing sound filled the air, like the hum of static from an old television set. I looked up, and for the briefest second, I saw a shadow dart past the crack at the bottom of my door. It was impossibly fast, like a flickering image on a bad signal. Pencilance. I took a step back, listening hard. The building was old. Weird electrical issues weren't unusual. But something about that shadow, about Mr. Holden's return, felt wrong. I needed proof. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and opened my apartment door as quietly as I could. The hallway was empty. Holden's door was closed, just as it should be. I took a deep breath and tiptoed closer, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. But then, a creaking sound came from inside. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps. But they weren't normal. They were too light, too hesitant, as if someone or something was trying to mimic the way a person walks, but didn't quite understand how. I took a step back, feeling an icy dread settle in my chest. And then, I heard something worse. A whisper, right against the door. It was faint, almost a breath rather than a voice, but I could make out two words. "Who's there?" I turned and rushed back into my apartment, slamming the door and locking it. My breathing was shallow, my body shaking. I fumbled to check my phone's call log. I needed to call someone, but my hands were trembling too much. Then, something made my blood turn to ice. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. I stared at the wood, my chest heaving. Another knock. I looked at the people, unsure if I even wanted to see what was on the other side. My instinct screamed not to check, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I peeked. Mr. Holden stood outside my door, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his features too stiff, like his skin was stretched too tightly over his bones. His mouth was open, just slightly, as if he were about to speak, but he didn't. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, as if he was looking through me rather than at me. And then, just as I was about to back away, his head snapped toward the peephole. A jerking, unnatural movement, like a glitch in reality. His lips moved, but no sound came out. And then, he grinned. The kind of grin that didn't belong on a human face. I stumbled back from the door, barely holding back a scream. My mind raced. Was this really Mr. Holden? Had I seen him leave, or had something else walked into his apartment? Something that looked like him but wasn't him at all? The knocking stopped. I waited, breathless, staring at the door. Then I heard it, the sound of my doorknob turning. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to break in. It was worse than that. It was slow, methodical, testing. I backed away, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I checked the lock again, even though I knew it was secure. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped my phone. I had to call someone. But who? The police. What would I even tell them? "Hello, officer?" My neighbor left, then came back, but he's not really my neighbor, and now he's trying to get into my apartment? I knew how that would sound. And then silence. The rattling stopped. I crept toward the peephole, my pulse hammering against my skull. The hallway was empty. No Mr. Holden. No shadow. No sign that anything had happened at all. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, before finally stepping away. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then, a whisper from inside my apartment, right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The room was empty. My living room, my kitchen, everything was as I had left it. But I knew what I had heard. It had been right next to my ear. My legs carried me backward until I hit the wall. My own apartment felt like a trap now, a cage. My skin prickled with an unnatural cold, a suffocating wrongness. And then my phone buzzed. I nearly screamed. My fingers fumbled to unlock it. An unknown number. I hesitated, but something, curiosity, fear, instinct made me answer. I put the phone to my ear. Static. A thick, suffocating, droning noise, like something old and broken trying to speak. Then, buried beneath the static, I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, barely there. Let me in. I dropped the phone. The screen went black. Something was inside my apartment. I forced myself to move, to run to the bathroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wood. My breath came in ragged, uneven gulps. Then, tap, 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 from inside the bathroom mirror. Number no. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My reflection stood there, staring back at me, but something was off. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Then it moved. Not mate. It tilted its head, just slightly, but I hadn't moved. I pressed my back harder against the door, my fingers numb, my chest constricting with terror. My reflection lifted a hand, but mine stayed at my sides. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Then my reflection smiled. A slow, unnatural, identical grin to the one I had seen on Mr. Holden. I choked on a breath, my heart pounding so violently I thought it would burst. Then my reflection spoke. You let him in. The light in the bathroom flickered. The air grew thick, suffocating, charged with something I couldn't describe. My reflection pressed its palm against the glass. I ran. I flung the bathroom door open and bolted for my front door. I didn't care if it was out there, I needed to get out. The second my fingers touched the lock, bang! A deafening slam from behind me. I turned. The bathroom door was wide open. The mirror was cracked down the middle, distorting the reflection. But the thing inside it was still smiling. And then, a knock at my front door. Number. No. I was trapped. The knocking grew louder. The reflection pressed harder against the mirror. The entire apartment felt like it was folding in on itself, like I was standing on the edge of something bottomless, something hungry. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, the front door unlocked itself. The knob turned. The door swung open. I didn't see who or what was standing there, because everything went black. I woke up the next morning, in my bed. The sun was streaming through my window, the warmth of daylight making it all seem unreal, a nightmare, a hallucination. But my apartment was different. The mirror in the bathroom was still cracked, and on my front door, scratched deep into the wood, were 3 words. He let me in. I moved out that day. I never saw Mr. Holden again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear knocking, and when I look in the mirror, sometimes my reflection still smiles first. I found the ad online late one night, buried in a forum I barely remembered clicking on. The title was simple: Roommate Wanted, Immediate Move, In Cheap Rent. The description was just as minimalistic: furnished room, quiet place, must be okay with weird hours. There was no photo, no details about the current tenant, just a phone number. I had been desperate to move out of my apartment. My lease was up, and I didn't have enough saved for a new deposit. So, against my better judgment, I texted the number. The response came almost instantly. Come by tonight. Room is yours if you want it. I hesitated. Who invites a stranger over in the middle of the night to check out a place? but my situation left me with no real choices, so I grabbed my jacket and headed to the address. The building was old, probably once a grand house that had been chopped up into smaller units. It sat at the end of a long, narrow street, its porch light flickering. The door creaked open before I could knock. A man stood there, barely visible in the dim hallway. He was tall and thin, his frame awkward, as if his limbs were just a little too long for his body. His clothes were dark, and his hair was messy, hanging over his eyes. "You came," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. I saw the ad." He stepped aside and motioned for me to enter without another word. The air inside smelled strange, not quite rotten, but close, like damp wood and something metallic. The hallway was lined with old wallpaper that peeled at the corners, revealing layers beneath it, like skin shedding from something long dead. The man led me to the room. "This is it," he said. It was simply bed, a desk, a small dresser, no decorations, no personal touches, just an empty space, waiting. "How much is the rent again?" I asked. $200. That was absurdly cheap. Too cheap. "Utilities included?" He nodded. "Only rule is, don't go in my room." He pointed to a door at the end of the hall. It was shut tightly, a single padlock hanging from the knob. A shiver ran through me, but I nodded. Yeah, of course. No problem. That night I barely slept. The house was too quiet, and every tiny sound floorboards creaking, distant whispers of wind felt magnified. At some point, I heard him moving around, footsteps soft but deliberate. Then came a sound like scratching, long drawn-out drags against wood. I told myself it was nothing. A week passed. I settled in as best as I could. My roommate, whose name I still didn't know, was barely around. He left at odd hours, sometimes just standing in the living room, staring at nothing before walking out the front door. He never ate, at least not that I saw, and every night, the scratching returned. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed down the hall, pressing my ear against his door. The sound was clearer now, slow, deliberate scrapes. Then, a whisper. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The whisper wasn't his voice. It was something else. Something guttural, something wrong. I rushed back to my room, locked the door, and buried myself under the covers like a child. I decided then I had to leave. The next morning I told him I was moving out. He didn't react, just stared at me with dark, unreadable eyes. "Okay," he said, "but don't leave tonight." I forced a laugh. "Why?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked away. That night the scratching was louder. It wasn't just in his room, it was in the walls, the ceiling, under the floor. I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming. Then the knob on my door twisted. It wasn't him. The footsteps outside my door were too heavy, too uneven. My breath caught in my throat as the door shook, the old wood rattling against the frame. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, but the call didn't go through. The screen flashed, "No service." The scratching grew frenzied, nails dragging violently against the walls. And then, from the other side of the door, a voice low, hungry. "Why don't you come see?" I screamed. The noise stopped. Silence stretched through the house, thick and suffocating. Then, the lock on my door snapped open, and the door began to creak open. I didn't wait. I threw myself at the window again, clawing at the latch with trembling fingers. It was stuck. My breath hitched as the door creaked further open. The air inside the room felt wrong, thick with something unseen, something waiting. A low, rasping breath came from the doorway. I turned, eyes wide, as the darkness beyond the threshold seemed to deepen. Then a shape moved. Not my roommate, not anything I recognized. It was tall, grotesquely thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The dim light from the hallway barely touched its skin pale, almost translucent. Its fingers were too long, too sharp, and they flexed as if testing their strength. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. I fell hard, knocking the nightstand over. My phone hit the floor. The screen lit up briefly before flickering out. No service. I had to get out. Now, the thing stepped forward, its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It dragged its nails against the doorframe, the same sound I had been hearing every night. The scratching. I lunged for the door, but before I could reach it, something wrapped around my ankle cold, clammy, inhuman. I kicked wildly, gasping as my foot connected with something solid. A hiss filled the room, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers up my spine. I scrambled to my feet, bolting into the hallway. The walls around me felt like they were pulsing, shifting. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that defied logic. Something was wrong with this house. My roommate's door was open now. The padlock dangled, broken, on the floor. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew I should just run. But something inside me made me glance inside. I wish I hadn't. The room was wrong. The floor stretched impossibly far, a vast empty space that shouldn't exist within the house. And in the center, a chair. My roommate sat there, his head tilted back, mouth hanging open as if frozen mid-scream. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets, black and endless. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, his arms bound by something thick and dark, like veins pulsating from the chair itself. And he was still breathing. I choked back a scream and ran. Down the stairs, past the peeling wallpaper that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The front door was locked. No, not locked, gone. The walls had sealed it up, as if the house itself was alive and refusing to let me leave. A deep, bone-rattling growl came from upstairs. My only chance was the basement. I didn't think, I just moved, throwing myself toward the narrow door beneath the staircase. It groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a set of uneven wooden steps descending into pitch-black darkness. Behind me, something started coming down the stairs. Not running, not walking, crawling. I took the stairs two at a time, hitting the bottom with a heavy thud. The air down here was thick, humid, and breathing. The walls pulsed, veins of something dark and wet crawling along the surfaces like roots. A sickly red light pulsed at the far end of the room, illuminating a door, a real door. I sprinted toward it. The moment my fingers touched the handle, a voice whispered right behind my ear, "Stay." I screamed and yanked the door open, expecting to find the outside, freedom, anything but more of this nightmare. But what was beyond that door was worse. It was my room, the exact same room I had just escaped from, down to the overturned nightstand and my lifeless phone on the floor. I turned, heart hammering. The basement was gone. The stairs were gone. Only the familiar walls of my rented room remained. I was back. I had never left. Something stood in the doorway. Not my roommate, not the thing from the hallway. It was me. A perfect, identical version of me. Same face, same clothes, same wide, terrified eyes. It smiled. Then the lights went out. The last thing I heard was the scratching. It started with a feeling, not a noise, not a shadow, just an unshakable sense of being watched. You know that creeping sensation at the back of your neck? The one that makes you turn around, even when you know you're alone? That was my first warning. I live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where the houses are old, their wooden floors groaning under footsteps long forgotten. My house, though slightly worn, never felt eerie before. At least, not until he started watching me. Across the street, in a house that seemed frozen in time, lived Mr. Holloway. He was an unsettling mantle and rail thin, his pale skin stretched too tight over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that disturbed me the most. Deep-set, sunken, like two empty voids that swallowed light. For 3 years, I had lived across from him, but I could count on one hand the number of times I'd seen him leave the house, and never during the day. The first time I saw him staring, I thought it was a coincidence. It was late, around 2 a.m. when I woke up on the couch. The television was still on, the screen flickering with static, the remote lying just out of reach. The air in my house was cold, much colder than usual. A shiver crawled up my spine as I sat up, and then I saw him. Across the street, in his second-floor window, Mr. Holloway was standing perfectly still. His face was pressed so close to the glass that I could see every deep wrinkle, every dry crack in his skin. His eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking. I froze. My mind searched for a rational explanation. Maybe he was just looking outside. Maybe he heard a noise. But he didn't move, not an inch. I lifted a hand in an awkward wave, hoping he'd snap out of whatever trance he was in. He didn't react. He just stood there, staring. The sight of him, so rigid and unmoving, sent a pulse of unease through my veins. I turned off my television and went to bed, telling myself that it didn't mean anything. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the window. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, my room was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that feels suffocating. The air was too still, too quiet. My skin prickled with unease. Something was wrong. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I noticed it. My curtains were open. I never left my curtains open at night. Never. A sound came from outside, a soft, deliberate creak, like weight shifting. Someone was standing outside my window. A tall, hunched shadow pressed against the glass. My breath hitched. That wasn't possible. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and flicked on the flashlight. The moment the beam of light hit the window, the shadow was gone. I sat there, paralyzed, ears straining in the silence. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. When morning finally came, I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe stress was getting to me. But as I stepped outside to go to work, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, not on the ground, on my bedroom window. 2 smeared, human-sized prints, pressed against the glass. I locked my house up tighter that night, checked every window twice, made sure the curtains were drawn, and yet that lingering feeling of being watched refused to fade. Then, at exactly 2:33 a.m., my phone buzzed. A single text message. "Look outside." My heart stopped. The number was unknown. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me not to, but against my better judgment, I peeked through the curtains, and I wished I hadn't. Standing in the middle of the street, directly under the flickering street lamp, was Mr. Holloway. His head was tilted back at a grotesque angle, mouth hanging open, his body stiff like a marionette. His arms dangled unnaturally at his sides. But his Aisha's soulless, empty eyes were locked onto my window, onto me. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "I see you." I stumbled backward, a cold sweat breaking over my skin. My breath hitched in my throat as I scrambled for my phone to call the police. But the moment I pressed the call button, the line went dead. The lights in my house flickered, then went out completely. And then the knocking started. First at the front door, then the back door, then my bedroom window. Slow, deliberate knocks, measured, unhurried, like a countdown. My chest tightened with terror. And then the doorknob rattled. I pressed myself against the far wall, my mind racing. Every door was locked. Every window was shut. He couldn't get in. But then the knocking stopped. For a moment, silence stretched thick through the house. And then a whisper. Not outside, not through the window. Inside, right behind me. And that's when I realized Mr. Holloway wasn't outside anymore. A whisper. Not outside, not beyond the window. Inside, right behind me. My body locked up, a wave of raw, primal fear slamming into my chest. My breath hitched. I couldn't turn around. I wouldn't turn around. The whisper wasn't words, it was wrong. A dry, rattling exhale, like air hissing through a cracked, hollow throat. I felt it. Close. Too close. A long, agonizing second passed before I forced myself to move. Slowly, inch by inch, I turned my head. My entire body was shaking. My stomach churned. The room was empty. But the air, it was thick, heavy. Like something unseen was standing right there, breathing against my neck, watching. Then, the floorboard creaked. Not under my feet. Near the door. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I ran. I lunged for the hallway, barely aware of my own movements. My feet pounded against the wooden floor as I tore through the house, panic consuming me. The walls blurred. My pulse roared in my ears. I reached the front door, my trembling hands fumbling with the lock. I yanked it open and nearly slammed into him. Mr. Holloway, standing on my porch. His face was inches from mine. His body was rigid, frozen like a mannequin, but his head was tilted back too far. His mouth slack. His skin, waxy and paper thin, clung to his skull. His lips curled upward, cracked and dry, in a grotesque approximation of a smile. And his eyes, black pits, empty, hollow. They weren't human anymore. He lifted a Hanslow, trembling, reaching. I slammed the door shut. Bang! The second the lock clicked, the knocking began. Harder this time. Bang, bang, bang. Faster. Like someone or something was frantic to get in. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from just the front door anymore. It was at the windows, at the back door, at the walls. My entire house shook with the force of it. Thin scraping noise. Not outside. Above me. The ceiling. My stomach dropped. Slowly, unwillingly, I tilted my head upward. And that's when I saw it. Through the slats of the ceiling vent, a hand. Not just a hand. His hand, long, skeletal, crawling through the narrow openings. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. He was inside. A sudden, harsh whisper slithered through the vents, curling around me like cold fingers. You shouldn't have looked. My blood turned to ice. I bolted. I didn't know where I was going just away. I tore through the house, barely aware of my own movements. My feet pounded against the floor as I ran blindly. Then, a noise. Not a whisper this time. A dry, rasping breath. Not behind me. Not above me. But in front of me. I skidded to a stop. Something was standing in the doorway to the basement. A figure. Tall. Thin. Hunched. Wrong. Its head tilted in a jerky, unnatural motion. A slow, deliberate movement. Like it was studying me. I didn't think. I ran straight for the basement. The only thought in my head was hide. I shoved past the figure. Felt the air turn cold as I brushed against it. My feet hit the stairs and I fell crashing, tumbling downward, landing hard on the cement floor. The door slammed shut above me. Pitch black. Silence. My breathing was ragged. My hands scrambled for my phone, fumbling in the darkness. My fingers swiped against the screen. Dead. Of course. And then, a shuffling sound. Not upstairs. Not behind the door. In the basement with me. I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could hear it moving, just beyond my reach. And then, it breathed. Loud, close. I backed against the wall, my fingers curling around something cold. A rusted pipe, a jagged metal scrap. I didn't care. I gripped it tight. The darkness shifted. Something stepped closer. My knuckles went white. I held my breath. It took another step and rushed me. I swung wildly and hit nothing. Air. The shape was gone. The silence that followed was worse. A thick, stretching quiet, pressing in on all sides. Then, the lights flickered on. The basement was empty. No shadow, no shape, nothing. I didn't wait. I bolted up the stairs, tore the door open, and ran. My feet barely touched the ground. The house blurred past me. I hit the front door, yanked it open, stumbled onto the porch, and stopped. The street was silent. No knocking, no whispering, no Mr. Holloway. I turned, panting, staring back at the house across the street. Dark, empty, as if no one had ever lived there. The front door hung open. The windows were hollow. Nothing inside. Nothing at all. And yet, I felt it. That same sensation from the very beginning. That prickling at the back of my neck. That presence. Watching. Waiting.